Hey everyone, what's up? My name is Luke and welcome back to another episode of the Crushing Small Stakes PLO course. In today's episode, we're going to talk about a requested topic, a scenario where I receive many questions about, and I see many people struggling with and feel uncertain about. And this is how to play and how to adjust your pre-flop strategy if your opponent has a no-fold or low-fold frequency facing a 3-bet. Now, this is exactly the topic of today's lesson. And before we're going to jump into the actual content here, we're going to look into setting the stage first and talk about what situation we're talking about today exactly. In this episode, we're going to look into a button versus cutoff strategy. So the cutoff open raises, we're sitting on the button, and we want to know how to adjust our range pre-flop, playing against the cutoff that doesn't like to fold against a 3-bet. So we're going to compare the GTO frequencies here with a 20% fold versus 3-bet, as well as a 0% fold frequency. Now, to get answers to the questions that we're looking for, we have to build simulations based on population tendencies or based on the actual situation that is occurring. So for example, in a GTO setting, the cutoff has to fold around 40% of his hands if the button 3-bets him. However, if we look at the population tendencies, we can see more often an average of around 20% fold versus 3-bet here. But there are also a lot of people who just doesn't like to fold at all here. And those people fold more around 0% of the time. So to come up to answers here, we're building simulations. And the first thing that I did here was to look into the cutoff RFI frequency here by the population, which is around 27% of the time. So the cutoff RFI for the simulation is set at 27% of the time. And I think this is a quite reasonable number, actually, when you think about it. It's a few percent less than a GTO RFI frequency here. But when you think about it, in a GTO setting, the cutoff, if he raises, he has a lot of fold equity because the cold calling ranges by the blinds and by the button are pretty tight. However, in reality, we face more often players that enter the pot there, and therefore we have less fold equity. And becoming a little bit tighter here is a pretty good strategy. So I think that a 27% RFI is a pretty good default number for any one of us, basically. Now then, we set the simulation as a fold versus 3-bet here. We run simulations with a 20% fold versus 3-bet. We run simulations with a 0% fold versus 3-bet. And we already have the 40% fold versus 3-bet in the GTO simulation. Now lastly, what I did here was I adjusted the 4-bet range by the cutoff slightly to make it a little bit more accurate towards how people are actually folding 4-betting here. What that means is I removed some of those 4-bet sort of bluffy hands, like those double-suited rundowns, like the Jack 9, 8, 7 double-suited, the disconnected ace-high double-suited rundowns. Like some of those hands are used as a 4-bet bluff in the GTO setting. But I don't really see people doing that at these stakes, and therefore I removed those and used a little bit more of a strong, value-heavy range in terms of 4-betting. So the strong high pairs that are much more common used as a 4-bet by the population here than those sort of rundownist type of hands. So these are sort of the parameters used to run the simulations and to come up with the answers that we're looking for. Let's look into the first situation here. In part 1 of this episode, we're going to look into aces, kings, and queens. So the strong high pairs. How should we adjust there? And should we adjust there at all? Now, in part 2, we're going to continue with lower pairs as well as the rundowns. Before we're going to jump into those hand examples, we want to look into the overall strategy here, button versus cutoff. So we have a versus GTO fold, we have a versus 20% fold, and we have versus 0% fold. If we look here at the table, you can see two interesting things. The first thing here is our 3-bet range. Versus GTO, we should 3-bet 9% of our range here, sitting in the button. However, if our opponent is folding only 20% of the time here, our 3-bet drops to 6.9. And if we look at a versus 0% fold by the cutoff, our 3-bet drops again, and this time to 5.4%. So you can see the less our opponent is folding, the less we should 3-bet. Secondly, we can see that our overall VPIP number is also dropping from 18.9% of the time to 15.9 to 15.7. So it's not the case that all the hands that were now not 3-betting anymore are simply put into our cold call range. Some of them are, but there are also a lot that are not being 3-bet anymore that we are now supposed to fold. So our overall VPIP drops down here. And I want you to remember these two adjustments because they are very important here. And you want to keep them in mind. Now let's look into the first example and also talk about why we're actually adjusting here. Let's start things off by looking into aces. Like, this is the most obvious 3-bet that we have in our range from any situation, from any position against any opponent basically. However, we can see here that if our opponent is not folding as often anymore, our 3-bet is actually dropping a little bit and our cold calling is increasing. You can see it in the table on the left. Against a GTO opponent, we are basically 3-betting any hand with aces. However, versus a 20% fold, the 3-bet drops to 89, and versus a 0% fold, the 3-bet drops to 83%. And there are a couple of reasons for it. One of the reasons why we are not 3-betting anymore as often here is that a lot of the aces, or many of the aces, they don't play as great in a 3-bet pot. They actually benefit quite a bit from the fold equity. A second reason here is that we can see is if we are not getting those folds anymore, we are now going to a flop. And if we see the flop, we are guaranteed to pay the rake basically. And the rake at low stakes is pretty high. And the rake basically takes away some of the EV of our 3-bet there. Not having those folds anymore is actually pretty bad for many hands in our range, even for some of the aces. I'm going to give you some examples of aces that we should stop 3-betting and start cold calling here. And those aces are actually the most marginal aces. The aces that basically play the worst in a 3-bet pot. Aces that can't stack off anymore as often in 3-bet pots in general. And that actually benefits quite a bit from fold equity because these aces just simply don't flop as smoothly in 3-bet pots. These are the worst aces, like most of the rainbow aces, like aces king 4 for example, as well as aces 6-3 single suited, like disconnected single suited aces with a low suit. Like, those hands are very often now used as a cold call instead of as a 3-bet here. So it's not the case anymore that we want to 3-bet all these aces all the time. We are actually flatting a few of these aces. Now remember, we're still 3-betting most of the aces, which is totally fine, but a few selective aces are actually a great candidate to now cold call here. It's also a good way to strengthen our cold calling range a bit and to fight back if one of the blinds comes over the top and squeezes now. Let's continue by looking into the kings, which is a very important category of hands, of course. We are 3-betting quite a bit of kings in general, around 28, 27, 25% of the time, as you can see here in the table, in the graph. However, there are also a lot of kings that we're not 3-betting and cold calling, obviously for the reasons that we know. But the difference here is not as large as we might think. However, there are a few subtle and important adjustments that we should think about. We're 3-betting a little bit more equity-based here with our kings. And we don't 3-bet bluff some of the disconnected single-suited kings. Now, some of the single-suited kings that we are supposed to 3-bet at these low stakes might come as a surprise to you. Some of you who have studied this situation very deeply might recognize these hands and know that we are capable of 3-betting them because they benefit from fold equity pre-flop, but also they don't play as great as a cold call. They just don't flop that great. They don't play well if our opponent in the blinds starts squeezing, and therefore they are more used as sort of a 3-bet bluff here. Now again, not all of you might recognize these hands, and many of you will simply always call these hands. But for those of you who have studied the situations and know that we are capable of using some of the kings as a 3-bet bluff here to generate fold equity pre-flop, not having to pay the rake. These are kings like king, king, 8-5 single suited and king, king, jack, 7 single suited. Now these kings, we should stop 3-betting now and start cold calling. There are also kings that we are generally more leaning towards a cold call here, but are now interested in 3-betting. And these are kings like king, king, 5-5 single suited or king, king, jack, 10 single suited. Now these kings, many of us, they don't really 3-bet them here because they don't want to risk getting 4-bet. However, if we remove a lot of our opponents' 4-bet bluffing sort of hands, all these rundowns that are getting 4-bet quite aggressively by the cutoff, if he doesn't do that anymore and his 4-bet range is a little bit more value heavy, we are actually blocking more of those value range with these type of hands, and therefore the chance of getting 4-bet is much lower. And now, if our opponent is also not folding with 3-bets anymore, these kings actually play pretty well in the 3-bet pot. They flop quite smooth. They flop quite often very strong. They are capable of stacking off enough often. And the chance of getting 4-bet because we block these specific components is actually a little bit lower. So we are adding in a few equity and strong kings here that we are generally tend to cold call a little bit more. And now 3-bet them. And we remove some of those 3-bet sort of bluffs with weak kings that don't play as greatly as the cold call either, but benefit from fold equity. But the fold equity gets lower, and therefore these are now moving into our cold call. Now let's move into queens. And with queens, we see a decrease or decline basically in 3-bet numbers here quite a bit. You can see it in the chart again. And we're adjusting here our range again a little bit. We are again looking into a little bit more equity-based 3-bets. And we stop 3-bet bluffing some of the weak ace, queen, queen hands. Many of you might recognize these 3-bet bluffs that I'm going to show you here, like ace, queen, queen 4 and ace, queen, queen 7. Like these hands, they don't benefit as much from pulling in other people into from the blinds, for example. They also can fold out kings, of course, if they 3-bet, because kings are a high fold hand by the cutoff. But if he doesn't do that anymore, then the value of 3-betting these hands become much lower. In addition, also, these hands, they don't play as great as a cold call, obviously, because they don't have the nutted potential, especially with the non-nut suit, like the first example. The second one has a better potential there, of course, with the nut suit. But here we also have 3 spades, so the likelihood of flopping spades or a flush there is much lower already. So these hands are often used as sort of a 3-bet bluff. However, if our opponent is not folding anymore as often here, or not folding at all, these hands are great candidates now to stop 3-betting, but still cold call. They are too strong to fold. We don't want to fold them here on the button in position. We still have ace, queen, queen. So it's too strong to fold, but cold calling here is totally fine. In addition, we are now 3-betting a few combinations that are generally more leaning towards cold calling. For example, the double paired single suited connected queens, like queen, queen, 9, single suited. These hands are now strong enough to 3-bet. And those are in addition to our 3-betting range with this specific group of queens. In general, often these hands are not used as a 3-bet, but now against this characteristic of a cutoff player, this is an example that we now can add into our 3-betting range. But you can see that the 3-bet of queens drops from 14% to 13% to 9%. So the less often your opponent is folding, the less you should 3-bet with your queens. Now, so far, this is part 1 of talking about how to play against your opponent who doesn't like to fold versus 3-bet. And I will recommend you to jump into part 2, where we'll look into the lower pairs as well as into the double suited and single suited rundowns. Hope you enjoyed this first part. I want to cut it up into 2 parts because I don't want to make the episodes too long. Check out the next part and I will see you there talking about different combinations and how to adjust correctly with those categories of hands.